First and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation today, Shumana. It's really a pleasure to be here and to kind of be in this company in ways that I didn't expect. Actually, my presentation today is actually going to return us to where Therese and Amy started. Actually, we'll see there's a fantastic connection that I didn't realize was actually going to happen. So without further ado, July 2018. I'm in Karaköy, a neighborhood of Istanbul just along the European shore of the Bosphorus. A few blocks beyond where I stand, the waterfront has been leveled to make way for the new Galata port. But here along Kemeraltı Caddesi, there's still the strange patchwork of 8-story office buildings, small workshops built of brick, the Armenian Orthodox Church, and there, rising out of a back lot, a stand of trees 6 stories high. September 2019. There's a protest in Karaköy for climate justice. In a light rain, activists gather at the ferry before moving slowly along Söğütlü Çeşme Avenue. Along the way, I notice a small tree growing almost implausibly from the gap where a car barrier has been sunk into the sidewalk. Less than 2 feet high, it barely merits attention. As I was, you might have been surprised to find out that these 2 trees were the same species. But once having learned to look for the tree, you might be even more surprised to find out how often it came into view. It grows in vacant lots and alleys, but it also grows from building walls and sidewalks. The tree, like so many of Istanbul's wild things, seems to have a knack for growing from the city's seams. It's in between. As the long tradition of scholarship teaches us, nature functions as a powerful lens through which societies tell stories about themselves. Controlling nature, mastering it, managing it, exploiting it, protecting it, even assigning it agency. Naturalizing power in Anna Singh's apt formation requires empowering nature. Empowering nature means attributing to nature forms of agency we can understand. Yet nature, she continues, is also by definition that which escapes human attributions. Empowering nature has taken a particular form in Istanbul, a city whose geologies, topographies, waters, animals, and plants have all helped to undergird particular visions of the city and its proper peoples. In this city, certain trees, above all the cypress and the oriental plane tree, have helped to define a vision of Istanbul in which culture and human habitation are deeply rooted in the land. However, there's relatively little attention paid to the city's less charismatic trees. What is the Ailanthus Altissima? Why does it grow where it does? And what can placing this tree at the center of our attention help us understand about the city in which it grows? In my contribution today, I want to argue that trees like the Ailanthus, opportunistic, ruderal, urban, above all, weedy, ask us to think differently about the relationships between people, places, and the planet. My talk today engages the rapidly growing and vibrant body of scholarship on what we might call urban natures. Like our panel's theme of the plant humanities, what exactly an urban nature is and why it's useful depends on 2 linked questions. First, how are natural landscapes, species, and practices brought into urban spaces through art, architecture, urban design, and social life? I think something that's raised in all of the papers today. At the same time, urban nature also directs us toward a second question. What are the unexpected, weedy, and unruly forms of plant and animal life that take root in cities? For me, answering those questions provides a different way not only to tell stories about the past, but also to intervene in the present and articulate possibilities for the future. My talk today is organized in 3 parts. I begin with a brief discussion of the Ailanthus, sketching out some of the ways that it's moved across time and place. I then turn to the Istanbul writer Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, one of the city's most important writers of trees. I close by describing some of the places where the Ailanthus is taking root, trying to call attention to some of the city's weedy stories. Ailanthus Altissima, more commonly known in English as the tree of heaven or the swingle, is native to parts of Southeast Asia. It arrived in Europe in the mid-18th century after seeds were sent from Nanjing by a Jesuit priest to recipients in England. Its arrival, as those of you who know about this period in history, was part of a broader culture of chinoiserie that emerged during this time. But interestingly, it arrives in America in 1784 when the plant collector, horticulturalist, and landowner William Hamilton received a set of seeds. And here, actually, I didn't realize at the time, but this image comes out of the History of Early American Landscape Design project that Teresa and Amy have kind of helped to spearhead and lead, and provides a really kind of fascinating intersection between these stories. Over the following decades, the tree of heaven came to generate significant debate. Some arborists, geographers, and forest managers lauded the advantages of the tree. They highlighted aspects like the tree's ability to take root and flourish in dirty environments, and also to grow in landscapes otherwise stripped of nutrients. Others, however, came to worry about the tree's capacity to send out suckers and seedlings, propagating far outside the expectations of those who planted it. Moreover, in the aftermath of the 1842 Opium War and the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States of America, the Ailanthus's, quote, foreign roots made it a dangerous species. As Andrew Jackson Downing, the horticulturist and writer who was actually an initial and early supporter, came to editorialize in an 1852 essay in The Horticulturist, this tree had, quote, come over to this land of liberty under the garb of utility to make foul the air with its pestilent breath and devour the soil with its intermeddling roots, a tree that has the fair outside and the treacherous heart of the Asiatics. And again, it's helping us understand the ways in this particular tree comes to be understood as invasive in a way that intersects with a conversation about anti-Chinese discrimination and racism in 19th century America. Today, the tree has largely been erased from appropriate horticultural practice. Indeed, it's almost universally described as an invasive. Despite that, it's taken root in urban and suburban areas across much of the Northeast United States and much of Europe. So having briefly sketched out some of the tree's itinerary across time and place, I want to come back to Istanbul and Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, one of the city's foremost writer of trees. The Istanbul writer Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar was born in Istanbul in 1901 and died in the same city in 1962. He was this part of a generation of people who grew up in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, but spent most of his literary life writing as a citizen of the Republic of Turkey. Tanpınar's work has long been a research topic for literary scholars, as his stories, essays, and poetry provide a fascinating index of cultural and urban change. One of the books for which he is most well known is Five Cities, you see here, in Turkish, Beş Şehir. The book contains 5 essays originally published beginning in 1941 as serials in the literary journal Ülkü, with each essay covering a different city. His essay on Istanbul still stands as one of the key texts of and on the city. The essay is remarkable for any number of things, not least of which is Tanpınar's attention to the rhythms of what we can call the natural world. He writes about the migration of fish through the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, the movement of the winds, and above all, the city's trees. As he writes, in old Istanbul, if there's another beauty rivaling the majesty of architecture, it is the trees. To tell the truth, the tree is our architecture's and our entire life's most generous helper. Among the many growing things which appear in Tanpınar's essay are the wisteria, the poplar, the pistachio, the linden, the mastic, the erguvan, along with grapevines and acacia flowers. But the 2 most important trees for Tanpınar, the ones that have, quote, left a trace in the dreams and lives of Turks, are the cypress and the plane tree. What I find remarkable and suggestive about Tanpınar's essay is his characterization of Istanbul's trees not as passive objects in the backdrop, but as lively subjects of urban life. For example, he describes plane trees as having, quote, the air of a grandfather. The trees have a kind of agency in transmitting a sense of the city from one generation to the next. Indeed, there's an expansive temporality kind of grown into them. Tanpınar describes those who planted trees as being fully aware that they would not live to see the trees fully grown. That wasn't the point. Instead, he writes, those who planted trees, quote, knew that a tree entrusted to the earth was a value entrusted to the neighborhood, the district, even a community, and its entire faith. Although Tanpınar describes monumental trees that graced mosques and major monuments, he also turned to the small corners, stumbling across, quote, a small and stylish tomb, or perhaps a cemetery that you'd guess was a small garden because of the 2 cypress trees and the acacia flower, the grapevines hung between. Yet despite The beauty of Tanpınar's essay, there also remains an unspoken audience, something involved in the context of Turkey in the 1940s. Who is the we implied by Tanpınar's, quote, our architecture? Indeed, his audience is defined both in ethno-linguistic and religious terms, a Turkish-speaking Muslim audience who sees themselves in relation to the city's mosques, madrasas, and other monuments. As a result, Tanpınar's evocative description of nature ends up naturalizing an urban landscape in which only Turkish-speaking Muslims become visible. Reading Tanpınar thus asks us to pay attention both to how trees are intertwined with human life, but also to think critically about how specific trees can be used to naturalize the belonging of some people and not others. Shifting our focus to contemporary Istanbul, however, presents a very different sort of challenge for trees. In nearly every respect, we have completely left behind the botanical city that Tanpınar described. In its place, we have a city in which common natural landscapes have been destroyed or dispossessed, and nature is increasingly a privatized commodity subject to the logic of markets. Meanwhile, the country more broadly is facing a cascading set of ecological issues, ranging from drought and water shortages in Istanbul to the catastrophes of power generation on the Black Sea, to the human and environmental consequences of extractive industry. Take the case of the recently completed Chamlinja Mosque, opened to the public in June 2018, built on Istanbul's tallest hill. As President Erdogan's dedication, kind of memorialized and monumentalized in a plaque on the mosque itself, says, our mosques, which are the seal we've stamped upon our geography, will continue nourishing our spirit until the day of judgment. The mosque is defined by a vast plaza of polished marble. Aside from a handful of fenced-in rose gardens and narrow strips of grass, there's no trace of the balance and humility that Tanpınar found. In laying out this opposition, I want to be clear. Being nostalgic for the city that used to be is not a viable critical or political strategy. But to read Tanpınar as a kind of urban political ecologist is to begin to look for other kinds of trees to tell other kinds of stories. In other words, if we want to search for alternative analytical modes, we need to expand the range of trees and thus the range of relationships that through which we come to make sense of belonging in the city. One of the places today you'd be most likely to find an Ailanthus tree in Istanbul is beside the city's tombs. In the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the architectural historian Abdullah Kuran produced a remarkable photographic archive of Istanbul's Ottoman-era monuments. Although he did not try to look for the Ailanthus, many of his photographs, such as the two you see here, document the ways that the Ailanthus came to take root opportunistically in and beside these Ottoman-era monuments. Their co-presence was no accident. For a variety of institutional, cultural, and political reasons, many of these monuments had received relatively little in the way of formal, sustained conservation. In the graveyards and courtyards of the city's tombs and Sufi lodges, particularly less prominent sites, the Ailanthus took root. One could tell this as a straightforward story of neglect by secular authorities. However, there's another part to this weedy story. Nearly all of Istanbul's tombs and other historical monuments are registered Waqf property, meaning they belong to an Islamic endowment, meaning that they and their surroundings were legally alienated from property markets. Given Istanbul's often improvisational forms of urban development, however, the immediate environs of sites like these were often filled with gaps and vacant lots, places whose legal status prevented, even as it enabled, certain kinds of development and real estate speculation. These places were one site the Ailanthus came to take root. The district of Balat, Istanbul, was once one of the centers of the city's minority life. A mixed neighborhood home to Greeks and Jews, that character shifted over the course of the 20th centuries. Pogroms against the city's Greek populations in 1955, the slow migration of Jews from Turkey to elsewhere, the polluting of the Golden Horn, and the influx of new migrants from Anatolia as the neighborhood fell into a state of disrepair. Beginning in the early 2000s, parts of this district became the center for a new set of discourses around cosmopolitanism, heritage, and Istanbul's related to Europe. Although some did rejoice at the return of a cosmopolitan identity, others pointed out that its reinvention might also require the dispossession of those who came to live in the neighborhood during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What would happen to those residents who came to live among those complex histories? Amidst all of this, Ailanthus trees grow everywhere in Balat, from boarded up lots, from the narrow plots of land between houses, from the courtyards of improvised gecekondu, from the edges of sidewalks, and from parks. They thus mark the intersection of many intersecting stories: migration, dispossession, improvisation, homemaking, care, and even intention. In contrast to Tanpınar's city of cypress and plane trees, the Ailanthus asks us to think about other forms of exclusion and marginalization that have made the city. The stories of these trees involve more than just dispossession and displacement. Consider the vacant lot with which I began this talk. Many of the stores here, many of the buildings here were once commercial buildings, workplaces that serviced the docks that line the shore. As with Balat, some of the buildings may once have been owned by Armenian, Greek, or Jewish families, but they may also be caught in the middle of a slightly different story, that of inheritance law in Turkey. When property is passed from generation to generation, it is usually split between the siblings. On passing to the following generation, it's split again. What emerges is a complex geography of ownership in the city, with shares held by later descendants who live distant from each other, if they can be found at all. In the absence of agreement between all invested parties, development projects and real estate transactions can linger for years, if not decades. Even once a building has been taken down, its lot, as perhaps with the one photographed above, might linger. These lots are better understood not as vacant ones, but as weedy ones, sites that both record and reproduce the encounters between family, law, real estate, and ecology. My grandmother, Muazzez Egi, returned to Istanbul in 2003 after almost 5 decades of living in the United States of America. As she neared the end of her life, my uncle and aunt spent a great deal of time trying to find where my grandmother's mother, İhsan Parlakses, had been buried. Because Istanbul's cemeteries are so crowded, it's often difficult to find a plot unless one can point to an existing family claim. This is especially true in the city's oldest cemeteries, such as Karaca Ahmet Cemetery in Üsküdar. Eventually, they found my great-grandmother's plot, tucked a few feet away from one of the main roads through the cemetery and in the shadow of a quince tree. My grandmother passed away in 2014, and I visit her every time I return to the city. The city, of course, is filled with cypress. The cemetery, of course, is filled with cypress trees, but it is also home to many other forms of life. Istanbul's dogs, of course, and crows and pigeons and swallows and gulls winging high above. There are rose bushes and geraniums and fruit trees, but there are also ailanthus that grow among untended graves and in the forgotten corners of the cemetery. Who, both human and otherwise, gets to belong? And how do these forms of life come to transform the world around them? Thank you very much.